number of mutually beneficial agreements. Former FIFA Vice President Jack Warner has to pay almost $80 million for his role in a football bribery scandal. And mass raids to deport immigrants in the U.S. are set to take place this weekend. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South. I am Doris Polo. Following 3 days of talks in Barbados, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs has announced that Venezuela's government and opposition are continuing negotiations which were initiated in Oslo. A communique released on Thursday says that, quote, as part of this process, a negotiation table has been established that will work in a continuous and efficient manner to reach an agreed-upon solution within the framework of the Constitution, end quote. The statement also urged both parties to use caution when making comments about the process and thanked the government of Barbados for its hospitality. Our correspondent in Caracas, Adriana Sivori, brings us the latest.
This new round at the negotiation table culminated on Wednesday between the government and the Venezuelan opposition. That is what was announced by the Minister of Communication through social media. I'll read precisely what it is he said. This day of the permanent dialogue table for peace ends in Barbados, a space for settling disputes through constitutional and peaceful means, successful exchange sponsored by the government of Norway. We thank the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, for her hospitality. There were 3 days of closed-door negotiations, as have been the negotiations between the government and the opposition. The issues which had been announced for the first time back in May in Oslo, which is when the round of conversations began, include economic issues, the political issues, and also the electoral issue. It's been interesting with regards to the electoral issue. The government had always announced through the course of these weeks that there would be another round of negotiations, that there would be news from these conversations in order to reach stability in Venezuela. All the while, the opposition had denied these conversations and didn't say anything in regards to this issue, and at last they sat down on Monday once again. And the issues, like I mentioned, were primarily the political, the economic, and the electoral issues. There was something very interesting that happened on social media and in the daily news publications. For example, they spoke about how among the issues debated was whether or not there would be a general election by year's end, and speculation about an election the coming year, and a number of rumors spurring over what is being discussed at the dialogue table, all of which remains purely speculative.
That was Adriana Sivori with that report. Now we stay in Venezuela, where the Attorney General announced on Wednesday that one of the men responsible for burning alive Orlando Figuera during violent opposition protests in May 2017 has been arrested in Spain. Venezuela's public ministry had made a request to Interpol for the capture of Enzo Francini Oliveros after he was identified in videos. The top prosecutor says that the suspect is accused of public instigation, manslaughter, and terrorism. It was widely believed that Orlando Figuera was burnt to death because he was a black man and a supporter of the late President Hugo Chavez. His murder was one of the main acts of violence that led to Venezuela's Constituent Assembly adopting a law against hate crimes.
Between April and July 2017, 167 people died in violent protests called by the Venezuelan opposition, according to figures from the Public Prosecutor's Office. Some were burnt alive, others were shot or killed by homemade bombs. 2 out of 3 of the victims that year were identified as Chavistas, and 65% were not taking part in any protest. This was on top of the deaths in 2014 in an earlier wave of right-wing violence.
cuando asesinan a mi hijo, la consigna era...
When they killed my son, their slogan was, "Kill a soldier for your country." People celebrated the murder of my son and all the others. In 2014, they killed 6 members of the National Guard, 2 policemen and a public prosecutor, and they were delighted with that. 850 people were injured, 250 of them public officials. Some were left paralyzed, and they celebrated all that.
de los cuales 250 son funcionarios, muchos que quedaron parapléjicos en cama.
It was these events that motivated one of the first tasks of the Constituent Assembly, sworn in July 2017, to pass a law against hate crimes, which came into force in November 2017.
There are cases from 2014 which still haven't reached a final verdict. There are cases from 2017 where the justice system has been slow to deliver justice to the victims and heal our society.
Hate crimes is a legal category that was first applied in the United States to deal with crimes against African Americans, indigenous people, and the LGBTI community. The Constituent Assembly has continued to refine the law to make it more effective against such acts of violence.
En Venezuela, el pico de la violencia.
Venezuela, the rise in hate crimes has been a consequence of the political situation. So we have been adapting this international category to the reality in our country so that it can be a really effective tool to achieve justice.
A los sistemas de aplicación para que realmente haya una justicia.
The legislation aims to punish both concrete acts of aggression as well as violent conduct on social media, cyber harassment, and digital persecution. A further stage of dissemination and public education is now beginning in an effort to prevent hate crimes before they occur.
The Bolivian president, Evo Morales, is in Russia, where he has signed a number of agreements. Morales arrived in Moscow in the morning and headed straight into talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two leaders then spoke about their agreements, which cover electric and nuclear power, agriculture, the lithium industry, and security. Putin thanked the Bolivian leader for helping to build a multilateral political system that supports international law and defends democracy and the sovereign rights of each state.
We just signed a joint declaration that underlined the very important and strategic character of the relationship between Russia and Bolivia. We expressed our strong political commitment to Bolivia's development. We place special emphasis on economic relations, and we've agreed to expand the volume of investment and trade.
For Bolivia and Latin America, Russia is hugely important in the international context over a lot of political issues. It is important that Russia leads the defense of international law. There can be unilateral positions, there can be impositions and interventions. A few governments are fighting for sovereignty and independence of our states.
President Putin was also very clear about the situation in Venezuela.
We've talked about the situation in Venezuela, and we made clear that for us, interference in Venezuelan affairs is completely unacceptable. President Evo Morales shares this position, and we hope that in the talks between the Venezuelan government and the opposition, facilitated by Norway, there will be solutions that are acceptable to all Venezuelans and which allow for a normalization of the situation.
In Brazil, the lower house of Congress has voted in favor of pension reform, despite months of protests against the proposal. The House voted 379 for and 131 against in this first reading of President Jair Bolsonaro's key pension bill. The House will now debate amendments before a second vote. If approved then, it will move to the Senate after the congressional recess. The government says the reform is meant to save billions from the federal budget. But the opposition says it is a brutal attack on basic rights.
These reforms are aimed at reducing inequality. I'm sure that is the goal of all parliamentarians here, those who voted for and also against the bill.
Congratulations to Speaker Rodrigo Maia for leading the work on this reform that we are approving now. you're leaving your name in the history of Brazil.
I don't have a doubt that this reform is a brutal attack on workers through the worst possible methods. I'm very ashamed at what is happening here tonight.
Now, there were more protests against the pension reform. Before and after the vote, thousands marched through the center of Sao Paulo, threatening to bring Brazil to a standstill if the bill is finally passed into law. And in Brasilia, protesters tried to break into the Congress before they were driven back by the police with tear gas and pepper spray.
Today is a very difficult day because we see that the majority in Congress wants to vote in favor. Our bench, the opposition, is very small, but the people are on the streets, and when it comes to rights, a lot is won from the street, from popular pressure and mobilization.
The working class is living in misery. Heads of families are living on the street because they can't pay the rent. It's tough. So before they mess with the pockets of the poor, they have to reach inside their own pockets, because there are many people there in Congress retiring at 40, 50 years, and we have to die to retire.
As we take a deeper look at this pension reform, we are joined by the Brazilian journalist Breno Altman. The refrain to justify the pension bill is that the government is on the edge of a recession, and this reform is the only way of boosting the economy. Is that true?
No, I think it's a lie. And it's a lie in other countries also. Every time we had pension reforms in the world was always to take money from the workers to the banks. It's did not help to develop internal market. On the contrary, every time you have pensions reform, what you have is less money in the hand of people, more money in the hand of the biggest economic groups, the financial corporations. It's really a big lie in Brazil when the government affirms that the pension reform will help our economy.
So what would you say is the most important aspect of this reform, and what would it mean in the lives of ordinary Brazilians?
Well, for instance, this reform established a new exigence of age to be, in order to be reformed. It established we have to work 40 years in order to have an integral pension. You are going to have to work at least 20 years in a formal way. The median, your pension will be calculated after this pension reform as the median of all the wages you receive in your life. What it means that the pension will be very reduced in comparison of the actual system. We're talking about for a lot of changes in the pension system against workers, against people who work since very early in their life.
So as you mentioned the working class, do you feel or do you agree with people that are saying that the pension system in Brazil is too generous?
I don't think so. I don't think so. We are talking about a very strong system. It was a democratic conquest of the redemocratization in Brazil after the 80s. It's a solidarity, it's a system based in repartition, but it's not very generous. I mean, of course, we have a lot of privilege in the top of the public system, but these privileges are not being attacked by this pension reform. For instance, police and armed forces. The judiciary system is out of the pension reform. This pension reform attacks mainly the poorest workers in our economy.
So yesterday's protests seem to have been a bit smaller than the organizers had hoped, but the legislative process still has some way to go. Do you think there's time and enough pressure to block or perhaps change the pension bill either in Congress or in the streets?
I think so, but we have to understand that there is a very strong mediatic battle in favor of this pension reform. We are talking the battle for this pension reform unified the ruling classes in Brazil, the mainly media systems and the government and the deputies. I mean, the side in favor of pension reform is very strong, but I think that we are going towards, in the next days and weeks, stronger social mobilization in the streets against pension reform. This reform is supposed to be voted in order to be approved. Is supposed to be voted for a second time at the lower house and at first and second times at the Senate. I mean, the social movement, the unions still have time to fight against pension reform in the next couple of weeks before it's eventually being approved by the parliament.
Thank you so much, Breno, for your insight on the effects of that proposed pension reform by President Jair Bolsonaro.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm always ready to talk to Telesur.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll take a short break now. Join us in a few. Welcome back. The former FIFA Vice President Jack Warner has been ordered to pay a $79 million penalty stemming from the Football Association bribery scandal. A U.S. federal judge imposed the judgment against Warner, a Trinidad and Tobago national, in a 2017 lawsuit brought by the Confederation of North, Central America and Caribbean Association Football. Warner is accused of embezzling millions of dollars from the CONCACAF. He's also accused of other corruption offenses. Warner has denied any wrongdoing as he continues to fight extradition in his homeland where he remains on bail.
No comments.
And following the U.S. federal court ruling, plaintiff lawyer John Custer has said that the football organization, quote, intends to pursue all available avenues to enforce the judgment and any jurisdiction where CONCACAF has reason to believe Mr. Warner may have assets, end quote. It's a no deal. Late negotiations between Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda have collapsed. The discussions, which took place earlier this week in Antigua, reportedly lasted only a few hours before breaking down. Reports state that one of the sticking points to Barbados selling its 49.4% majority stake in the regional airline was Prime Minister Mia Mottley's insistence that Antigua and Barbuda would have to take up Barbados's almost $100 million loan commitments. That debt is due mainly to a loan from the Caribbean Development Bank, which was used to purchase 3 Liat aircrafts. Liat needs $5.4 million in emergency funding to keep the airline in the sky. A student congress is underway in Brazil, where thousands of youth are discussing various socio-political issues facing the country. Our correspondent in Brasilia, Danai Gaetti, has more.
Brazilia's National University is hosting a summit for university students from across Brazil in the hopes of bringing together 10,000 students to discuss and reflect on Brazil's socio-political landscape. One of the main topics to be discussed is the so-called crime-fighting bill proposed by the Justice Minister Sergio Moro and the scandals gripping both Moro and the Lava Jato prosecutors. Following leaks that show Moro colluded with the prosecutors to jail former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva,
Silva. Other issues to be discussed are the fight against budget cuts in the education sector promoted by far-right President Jair Bolsonaro and the recently approved pension reform, as well as the fight for Lula's freedom.
That was Denai Gayeti with that report. Police have fired guns and tear gas during protests in Nigeria staged by members of the Islamic movement. Eyewitnesses say while it did not appear the police were aiming at protesters, officers were firing live rounds. Protesters are demanding the release of their jailed leader, Ibrahim Zakzaki, who they say needs urgent medical attention. Zakzaki has been in custody since 2015 for allegedly attempting to kill the army chief. On Tuesday, Nigeria's National Assembly went into lockdown after gunshots erupted during a violent confrontation between the sides. We'll take a short break now. Don't go away. Welcome back. The United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has announced they will carry out mass raids to deport migrants over the weekend. Our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Jorge Gestoso, brings us the details.
Thank you. According to the New York Times, this weekend are going to start the massive deportations of migrants. It's speculated that could be about thousands of them that have already received papers of deportation and didn't leave the country. It's speculated that could be taking place in among 10 cities in the country, and they don't know exactly where they're going to place them, and the speculation is that could be in hotels that could take between at least 10 and more days to make them leave the country. And the president of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has already warned everybody that if the representative of ICE show up to the different homes in order to request that people to leave, they need to present at least 2 types of documents, papers, and if not, they are not supposed to open the door. We get back to you now.
Shifting gears now, the state of Louisiana in the U.S. is bracing for impact as Tropical Storm Barry formed over the Gulf of Mexico on Thursday morning. The National Hurricane Center declared Barry the second named storm of the Atlantic hurricane season, with maximum sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and moving west at 5 miles per hour. Hurricane watches have been issued, a state of emergency has been declared, and over 10,000 people have been told to evacuate from along Louisiana's coast. In Ireland, farmers piled Wellington boots outside Parliament in protest against the newly struck EU-Mercosur trade deal. The farmers are demanding the deal be revoked as they fear that their livelihoods would be undercut by cheap South American imports. Protesters expressed fear that South American beef would flood the market and undercut domestic production. Belgium, which struck the deal, said the pact with the South American bloc will save European companies more than $4 million in duties every year. Meanwhile, Ireland's Prime Minister has pledged to make an economic assessment of the deal and vote against it if it is bad for the Irish economy.
The big problem we have as farmers is the doublespeak within the EU. They have restrictions on farmers, environmental restrictions on farmers all around Europe, and we have to farm in an environmental way. And then suddenly they will do a deal with a country that absolutely flouts that.
At least 7 people have been injured in a huge fire that broke out inside an electricity generating station in Russia. Drone footage captured the massive extent of damage caused by the blaze that engulfed the plant in the Moscow region. By some estimates, the flames went up 50 meters, with the fire covering a 1,000 square meter area. Initial reports said there was an explosion at the power plant before the fire broke out. And now we move to sports. England have qualified for their first Cricket World Cup final in 27 years with an 8-wicket demolition of Australia at Edgbaston in the United Kingdom. Facing New Zealand in the finals on Sunday, England blowed their rivals Australia away with a 226-for-2 win against a 223 all-out. Aaron Finch's decision to bat appeared to backfire with Chris Woakes and Jofra Archer batting away the Australian top order. Man of the match Chris Woakes took 3 for 20, outing David Warner, Australia's leading scorer in the tournament, for 9. It's the first time defending champions Australia have been bundled out in the semi-final stage, having won the title 5 times. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories, as always, on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.